Welcome back. Today we will be reading Chapter 3 from Nothing's Fair in 5th grade. And this chapter is called The Finger Points. Follow along with me as I read. Whenever I brought lunch money to school, I put it in my desk, or sometimes I left it on my desk, even though I knew I wasn't supposed to. Nobody had ever taken anything in our room, and if I kept my money in my pocket, I could lose it. If you lose your money, the school won't give you a free lunch. The teachers won't lend you money either. What you have to do is go to the office and get a frozen peanut butter sandwich from the secretary. She keeps a whole bunch of them in the refrigerator in the faculty room. It's a pain because they never completely thaw in time for lunch. Some kids just go hungry instead of trying to eat the secretary's sandwiches. I guess the school figures this cuts down on kids forgetting their lunch money. Halfway through the 5th grade year, there was no money out on anyone's desk. Quarters were disappearing every day. Mary Ann was the first to lose money. I thought it was just an accident. I guess Mrs. Hanson did too. She told Mary Ann to look through her desk. Mary Ann did, but she ended up with a peanut butter sandwich. Some kids gave her their cookies, and Jack gave her his milk. He told her he didn't like milk, but I know he always drank it before. The next day, Roy's money was gone. He missed it right after recess. He took out all the junk from his desk and spread it all over the floor. It took him till lunchtime to sift through the mess, but he ended up with a peanut butter sandwich too. The third day, Diane's money was missing. Now, Diane isn't messy, and she isn't forgetful, and she isn't the type to be quiet about getting a peanut butter sandwich in place of a hot lunch. I put my money right here in my desk, Diane said clearly. It was here before recess, and it isn't here now. Somebody stole it. Diane, you don't know that, Mrs. Hanson said. Diane looked up at her. Where are my quarters then? I thought Mrs. Hanson would really give it to her for being rude. Instead, she just told her to go through her desk once more. Diane pursed her lips and gave a big impatient sigh, and kneeled down by her desk. Mrs. Hanson kneeled down too, not to look in Diane's desk, but to look in the one in front of it, Richard's. Maybe Richard took the money. As she poked around his desk, Richard jumped out of his seat. Hey, I ain't a thief. Am not, Mrs. Hanson corrected him, and I didn't say you were. Empty your pants pockets. Richard yanked out the lining of his empty pants pockets. Mrs. Hanson moved back to search my desk. I felt my face burn as I remembered I sat behind Roy, who had lost his money, and besides Diane, who had lost her money. I didn't sit by Mary Ann, though. I hope none of the kids thought that I stole the money. Mrs. Hanson held out her hand. Let me see your purse. I gave her my purse. She looked through it carefully. The only money that was in it was the 50 cents for my lunch. I was lucky I didn't have my birthday money in it. Diane stood up and crossed her arms. Her black eyes glittered. There is no money anywhere in my desk. Mrs. Hanson gave me back my purse. Do you have a purse, Diane? She asked. No, I don't, Diane said. Go look in your coat pockets. Diane stamped over to the girls' coat closet, took down her coat, and pulled out the pockets. Except for a wad of Kleenex, they were empty. Diane, Mrs. Hanson said, are you certain that you brought your lunch money to school? Yes, I am, Diane answered. Mrs. Hanson looked around the whole class. If Diane brought her money into this classroom, it must still be here. I don't think we'll have lunch until we find Diane's money. I stuffed my books back in my desk. This was going to be a disaster. I don't know why teachers do this. Who would ever tell after all that fuss? When we heard the lunch cart in the hall, Mrs. Hanson sat on her desk. I guess we'll just be hungry until the money turns up, she said. But it didn't work. We sat there in silence until one of the cooks stuck her head in the room and said we'd have to line up for lunch right away, or the lunch cart would leave for the 6th grade unit. Mrs. Hanson lined us up. I'd wonder if she'd keep us after school. She didn't. I was still mad at Mrs. Hanson when I walked home with Diane and Sharon. I thought it was mean of her to make me look like a thief. Sharon said she didn't think it was mean because I did sit by Roy and Diane. And besides, Mrs. Hanson had looked in Richard's desk too. I got upset all over again and started hollering that where we sat didn't make any difference. Diane said to cool it. What really mattered was who was taking the money. Diane thought it might be Jack. I didn't think so because Jack had given Mary Ann his milk. Maybe he figured he owed it to her, Sharon suggested. I think it's Elsie, I said. No, Diane said. Her mother looks like they're loaded with money. That doesn't mean she gives Elsie any, I argued. She said her mother hates her. She didn't say her mother hates her, Diane corrected me. Well, her mother's ashamed of her. Anyway, if her mother gave her $1, she'd probably buy a cake. True, said Diane. When I got home, I followed my mother around the kitchen while she made dinner. I was all wound up and wanted her to listen to the whole story. I told her Mrs. Hanson practically accused Richard and me of stealing. My mother asked me, "Did you take the money?" Anger just swooshed over me again. "What are you talking about?" I screamed at her. "Do you think I would steal?" I ran up to my room and I slammed the door. She came up later to tell me dinner was ready. I told her I didn't want any. My mother said quietly that she had simply asked me a question about taking the money. She hadn't accused me of anything. I didn't look at her. She went away. I turned on my radio. I was starving. I was on my bed staring at the ceiling when Kenny pushed open my door. "Jenny, why don't you want to eat?" he asked. "Get out of here," I yelled. I dashed over to the door and shoved him out hard. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe so that you can listen to my next chapter.